Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're just going to wait a short few seconds for other people to connect. I see the numbers are slowly rising already. Thank you for joining us for this third session of the day here in Bonn. Thank you especially if you're in a similar time zone and have been following us since early this morning. So our session is today on community representation and community leadership in planned relocation. We'll be focusing on this theme to try and go a little bit beyond superficial understandings of what community is, the ways in which they can and should be involved in relocation processes. We'll talk about the politics of relocation, the politics of decision-making, of knowledge, different perspectives, also between communities and external stakeholders. For this evening, we have three wonderful speakers that I'm delighted have accepted to join us. They are Alex Arnall, who will be speaking first. He's joining us from the University of Reading in the UK. Sostina Takure of the ACT Alliance in Zimbabwe, and Bronen joining us in her morning in Alaska. A couple of logistical points. If you'd like to ask a question of our attendees, please use the Q&A function. We'll keep an eye on it and are planning to come back to them at the end. We'll definitely have at least a half hour of conversation and hope to get to all of your questions in time. The second thing is if you need captions, there is a automatic closed captions option in Zoom that you can activate if that's something that's helpful to you. So thanks again for joining, and I'll get straight into it. Our first speaker will be Alex Arnall, if you'd like to turn on your camera for us. So Alex teaches at the University of Reading in the United Kingdom on subjects that span climate change, human mobility, displacement and resettlement, with often a focus on how such processes can disrupt social practices and everyday life. He's conducted research on relocations in the Maldives, in Mozambique, and most recently in Fairborn in Wales, which he'll be focusing on today. He's going to talk a lot about science, the role of research, and relations with communities. So without any further details, Alex, please add anything you'd like about your own profile and experience, and take the floor for your first presentation.
Great. Well, thank you so much, David, for organizing this and for inviting me. And it's yes, it's an amazing agenda you've put together over the past few days. So very impressive. So yeah, very pleased to be part of this. Okay, I'm just going to get my slides going. I'm a little bit new to Zoom, but we had a little practice a couple of minutes ago, so should all work. Screen sharing. Hopefully you can see that okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. All right. My apologies, my voice is a little bit croaky. I haven't been very well, but I'm good enough to speak. But if I start coughing or getting croaky, then please bear with me during this. Okay, so yeah, as David said, I'm interested in coastlines and relocation issues related to climate change and environmental change more broadly. So this is the title of my talk. I'm interested in issues around knowledge and power, and my sort of argument that I'm going to present to you over the next sort of 10, 15 minutes or so is that where we have situations of community relocation linked to climate change and sea level rise, then we need to think about the climate change part of that as well as the relocation part. So what I mean by that more specifically is that we need to think about the politics of knowledge construction around climate change and the impacts of climate change, and the policies and interventions that flow from this process, from this knowledge. So what I'm saying is that although, of course, climate change and sea level rise are physical facts, what they mean for different communities and different places is quite variable. And the science, of course, as we know, the science of climate change and sea level rise is not neutral territory. So indeed, as I've put on this slide, knowledge is power in these situations. So then what I'm saying is that to make community participation meaningful in these situations, we need to engage with communities on the climate change science as well, on the sea level rise science, and not just kind of parachute it in and take it for granted that it's going to be accepted or understood. And as I mentioned, I'm interested in coastal communities in particular. And so within this, the science of sea level rise really comes in as very important. But further than that, also the science of coastlines and how coastlines work, coastal geomorphology is really important. And also, as is, in a way, what you might call the science of sea defenses as well, which for reasons that I'm going to get into on the next few slides. So we've got to think about the science of how the sea interacts with the land and how this is perceived and understood by communities that live in these places and engage with nature on a daily basis. So, as many will know, we have examples from around the world of where communities often seek relocation in response to climate change and sea level rise in a proactive manner. And indeed, you might hear some examples of that from this session. But I think it's generally fair to say that this isn't the case in the UK. In the UK context, coastal communities, of which there are many, many communities have become used to being protected by sea defenses for decades. However, what's happened in recent decades or recent years, there's been a shift in policy by government towards letting sea defenses go, to let them deteriorate, essentially. And that means that communities increasingly need to move. Now, the question of why this is occurring is quite complex, but it's related to concerns around climate change and sea level rise, to what you might call greater appreciation of the dynamics of how coastal dynamics operate, and that in many parts of the world, holding the line, coastlines, is no longer feasible. The problem, of course, is that relocation, at least in the UK context, is nearly always strongly resisted by those who are being asked to move. This is because people are attached to where they live and they expect sea defenses to be put in place or maintained indefinitely into the future. So in these cases, it's not really that people are questioning the underlying science of climate change. People are often quick to say they're not climate change skeptics. But what they are questioning is the ways in which the science is being used and is being interpreted, and it's kind of being inserted into their specific physical and social situations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide an illustration of this and some of these issues. I'm going to take the community of Fairbourne, which is a small coastal village located in the west of Wales. And for those interested, there's a paper that I've written that's come out very recently. This came out in Political Geography, and it is looking exactly at this case. So if you want more detail and more information, then please do go and take a look at the paper, and I can put a link in the chat later on. So, yeah, as I mentioned, Fairbourne is a small community It's located in West Wales. And the coast in this area is governed by what are called SMPs, for those not familiar with them. This stands for Shoreline Management Plans, and these set the overall context for how coasts are managed in particular areas. Fairborn is a small place, but symbolically, at least in terms of how we respond to climate change and sea level rise, it's become very large. Okay, it's attracted a huge amount of interest. I'm going to explain why in a second. So Fairborn was established in the Victorian era in West Wales, so about 150 years ago. And it began life as a small coastal resort on, it was built on a kind of a salt marsh, basically, at sea level, essentially. And the image on the right, this is early post-war, so this will be kind of late 1940s, early 50s, 1950s. I guess you can see it's still a small place. What's happened today, however, is that the community has grown in size considerably. So today there are around 460 properties, about 700 permanent residents living in Fairborn. I mean, it's a pretty sort of quiet place. Many people living there are retirees, people who've retired, they're older people. In the summer months, though, the village does get quite busy, maybe up to 3,000 people staying at any one time in the village, with an additional, say, 25,000 day visitors per year. And you can see on the right that the main defense from the sea for the village is this natural formed shingle bank that's topped with a sea wall. And if you can see from left to right in that image on the right, you can see actually the community is located pretty much at sea level, and it's just that that embankment there that is protecting the community from being flooded. So this is kind of where the controversy begins. So about 10 years ago, the local authorities decided that because of sea level rise specifically, they were no longer able to protect this settlement in the medium to long term. This was for fiscal reasons, but they saw it as no longer sustainable, no longer viable. And so the decision was made that by 2054, which is a kind of key date in the shoreline management plans, by 2054, the community would need to be decommissioned, and essentially these buildings would need to be demolished, the buildings of Fairborn demolished, returned to the sea, and the community relocated and moved away from this place. Now, this has attracted, as I mentioned, international attention, and the sort of sense of crisis in Fairborn has been reinforced by the prevalence of, sort of news stories which have, I think it's fair to say, sensationalized the fate of Fairborn as the UK's first climate change refugees. And also images such as the image on the left, which is showing some areas of localized flooding where the sea has overtopped the seawall during a recent winter storm. So what's happened is that it's quite a long story, which I don't have time to get into, but the community basically has resisted relocation on a range of grounds. Now, they accept climate change as a phenomenon, they say, but they're not prepared to name or diagnose sea level rise as an inevitable problem that will put the village at physical risk. So there are two main scientific disputes that are central to this debate. Okay, so I'm just going to go through what those are briefly now, just to illustrate the importance of the role of science in terms of community leadership and meaningful engagement. So the first dispute centers around sea level rise and its application. Just to give you a few quick figures, the sea level rise projections that were used by authorities, they used 1 meter by 2100, the year 2100, which corresponds to very high greenhouse gas emissions scenario used by the IPCC in their assessment report number 6. So if that range is applied, then what we see is a significantly increased risk of catastrophic sea flooding occurring in the community. So at present, the standard of protection in the community is about what's called T200. Okay, so that means every given year, there's a 0.5% chance that there will be a major flood in the community because of the sea overtopping the seawall, or the sea defenses failing in each given year. Now, if we use that 1 meter by 2100, year 2100, then it's been estimated the sea defenses will fail more than once per year, okay, which obviously is very significant. The community, however, and there's a lot more going on than I can explain in this short presentation, but the community argues that this assessment is too aggressive. They argue that more probable intermediate scenarios projecting around 0.5 meters rise should be used instead. So these numbers in the IPCC reports that have been adopted and applied have been contested, not because of the underlying science being questioned, but because the choice of ranges that have been used and applied to the models, to the sea level rise models and flooding models in this case. That's the first example. The second example is a bit more complex, but this relates to what I'm calling the science of coastal dynamics, okay, of which sea defense structures are central. So it's the position of the local authorities that it's not viable to maintain sea defenses into the medium to long term. It's too expensive and there's too great a risk of a catastrophic event, particularly because of sea level rise. Now, the community, for various reasons, disputes this as well. They say this is not the main threat. The main threat is actually coming from behind the village due to fluvial flooding. They maintain, or they argue, they have good sea defenses. And in fact, they even commissioned their own study in 2021, looking at or developing their own flood protection scheme. So this wasn't something provided by authorities. This is something they devised themselves, and some examples of that are given in the images. So they proposed their own flood protection scheme, consisting of 700 meters of new flood embankment across agricultural land, and the restoration and extension of the village's network of drainage ditches, and the creation of a temporary water storage pond, which you can see here in the image. So if this was built, then it's been estimated that Fairbourne would be protected in the worst case flooding scenario until 2065. Okay, so essentially extending the life of the village, and it's been argued that by the community that this is financially viable. So this is two quick examples of, if you might say, battlegrounds of knowledge around the science, the climate science of relocation, and this dispute is going on to this day. It's still not resolved or moving forwards particularly, although this scheme has been rejected by the council as unsustainable. So just to sum up then, what I've been talking about Fairbourne, but what I've been saying in addition is that the resettlement scheme, which has been developed in this case, is important, but so too, of course, is the science behind it. So in this case, knowledge of science of climate change and sea level rise, and of coastal geomorphology and coastal processes, is knowledge of these things is power. So then, I think, to give communities power in these processes, we need to give them ownership and leadership of the science, okay, to find a way to try to do that rather than parachuting the science in from outside and saying, well, this is what you've got to do. So what that means, I think, in these cases, therefore, we need to think carefully about how global science relates to the particular physical and social settings in which communities are located, and how these are applied to these places and how they might be interpreted. So in these cases, we can't rely on the objectivity of external expertise, because that will, at least in the UK, will be invariably contested. So we need to find ways to include local people in these scientific processes. And I think, yeah, that was my last sort of summarizing slide. So I think I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Alex. Wonderful. Thanks so much, and for these details on a case that I had come across for the first time through the British press, and this narrative of climate refugees. And in the questions, I think it'll be very interesting to come back also to this question of language and the narratives that surrounds such cases. So thanks so much. Next up, we are going to ask Sostina Takure to join us. Sostina, I'm aware that you've had a couple of connection issues, but are you with us now?
Yes, David, I'm here with you.
Wonderful, Sostina. Great to see you, and glad that you can manage to stay with us. So Sostina is a Zimbabwean human rights and development practitioner. She's got extensive experience in peace building and gender justice, in development and climate justice. And she currently coordinates the ACT Alliance Zimbabwe Forum. She's also been involved in the Climate Migration and Displacement Platform, which some of you might know, representing ACT Alliance in international fora. Sostina is going to talk about decision-making in Zimbabwe around this topic of planned relocation. Over to you, Sostina.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, David. And I'm really sorry that my network has decided to be erratic. It was fine the whole day, but we hope for the best. So I come from Zimbabwe, which is a landlocked country. And this country has been facing food insecurity and droughts, interspaced with floods induced by cyclones. And this has really greatly negatively affected our rain-fed agrarian economy. So climate change is very real to the people in communities in Zimbabwe, and coupled with poor political choices, the former breadbasket of Africa is now the begging bowl of the continent. And working with ACT Alliance, which is Action by Churches Together, we work with communities every day through the church. And I'm speaking from a community person's perspective. And today, I really want to talk about decision makers versus decision takers. First, David, let me go back to the issue of community. What do we mean when we say community? In my context, it means that these are people who live in the same geographical location, and they have shared values, shared culture, shared tradition, and at times they are kins, they have shared kinship. But we need to delve deeper to understand what it then means when it comes to decision making in these communities. They are what we now call community gatekeepers, those people who make decisions on behalf of the whole community. And when external researchers or the government or even NGOs come, they meet with those people and they make decisions on behalf of everyone else. So who are these people in a patriarchal society like Zimbabwe? They are the old men who are the headmen, the village heads, and the chiefs. One, these people, they don't till the land. They don't know how the effects of climate change are affecting the women who are responsible for tilling the land every day. So whatever decisions that they are going to make will have little knowledge on what really affects communities. Two, they are not concerned about the future that the young people are concerned about. They are concerned about preserving their culture, and also they're concerned about their grandparents' graves. We don't want to move because our graves are here. We don't want to move because I want to be buried where my grandfather was buried. But what's the implication on the young person who is now forced to stay because the community gatekeepers have refused to move? What then happens to the women who are forced to stay in an area where agriculture is no longer possible instead of moving to areas where they can get better living? So these are some of the dynamics that you get when you get to communities. You get people who are not even in touch with realities, making decisions on for everyone else. Then the second thing, what do we mean when we say state? In my context, we have devolved authority. There is the central government, which then goes down to what level, and you have these different governmental structures. And when you talk about states in Zimbabwe, you're talking about the central government. They are responsible for policy making. But unfortunately, these policies, the power to make policies is not devolved down to the community level, where you have district officers not even aware of Zimbabwe's NDCs. They are not even aware of Zimbabwe's national adaptation plans. They are not even aware of what is going on at the UNFCCC. So you get the Civil Protection Unit, which is responsible for disaster risk management and reduction, not even being able to respond when there is a breach that has overflowed. So you really can't expect these people to be able to respond when there's a cyclone. You can't expect those people to make any meaningful contributions to central government policy. They are marginalized, they are not part of the process. So that's why I say communities at the end of the day, they are decision takers and not decision makers. So the decisions that then affect our communities are made in hotels, in holiday resorts by central government, which is far removed from the realities on the ground. Zimbabwe is an arid country, as I said, and it is situated in a geographical area that we really don't have flooding. The only floods that we have is when Mozambique overflows and then the water then spills into Zimbabwe, or when South Africa, something happens in the Indian Ocean and then we suffer the ripple effects. But our problem is that we don't have water, especially as we depend on rain-fed agriculture. So to address these incessant droughts, my government then, from the 1950s, started constructing dams so that they can, capture the water, and then, we have irrigation schemes, which was really good to address these arid conditions. If you take, for example, Takure Dam in 2014, when it was constructed, 18,000 people were moved. The Zambezi Water Project, which was done in the 1950s by the colonial government, it's removed, I think, 23,000 people. I'm giving you these two examples to see that there was no policy shift between a colonial government and an indigenous government. When the people were moved from Kariba, from the Zambezi waterfront, when 23 people were moved to Binga, there were no repercussions. The state did not pay for the moving. They did not invest in infrastructure. So people were just dumped in Binga with no schools, no clinics. But at least in the 1950s, the colonial government, at least they gave them some sorts of, reparations, In 2014, Takure, when the government decided to have the dam there, and also the Osborne Dam, the people were moved and nothing was given to the people. They had to go into areas where they had no relatives, and they had to settle there with no land, and they had moved from their hundreds of acres of land. So you realize that when the state looks at communities in Zimbabwe, they are looking at the developmental projects that they can do to address climate change. They are not looking at the impact of that move on the people. So when we then say plant relocation, David, to me, it is state plant relocation. But for the communities, it is forced displacement. And what happens in my culture, in my culture and my my country is that if the state says move and you don't want to move, then the army comes in and they force you to move. So it is really forced displacement to us. I have yet to see a case of planned relocation where the government comes to the communities and says, you know, we want to have this project that will address the impacts of climate change, and you are going to benefit in this way, and we are going to relocate you there and give you this much, and we'll build this, and the community agrees and also shares their thoughts and thinking. That has never happened. It has always been top down. And I can say that in the 1950s, when the 23,000 people were moved to make way for the hydroelectric power generating Kariba Dam, they were moved to another area. And to 2023 in June or May, thereabouts, they had no access to the electricity that they moved away to pave way for. They only won the court case to have electricity in their homes in 2023 from the 1950s. How many years have passed? This has resulted in maladaptation practices. Communities had to cut down trees in order to have energy. They were put in the dry and tether-infested Binga, where the life became even harder than the life that they were leading when they were in Kariba. If you look at 2019, when we had Cyclone Idai in Zimbabwe, fortunately, I was born then. I wasn't born, 1950s, I wasn't there, but 2010, I was there and I was part of it. When we told people to move from their homes because of Cyclone Idai, and we put them in camps, in transit camps, this is now what, 3, 4, 5 years later? Some people are still in transit camps, while some have gravitated back to the risky areas that we asked them to move away from because we were not prepared. We had no land to settle them. And some of them, they said, where you want to take us is actually worse than where we were. So if that cyclone is to come back again using the same path, there are people who are going to be in danger because they moved back. The state had no planned relocation whatsoever. They after 3 years, they still don't know what to do with the people. And that is the same with Tokwe Mkosi. We still have people who are in transit camps, and people are choosing to move away on their own accord. When we speak about communities, David, we have to understand that communities also congregate around a shared aspect. And when we are talking of climate change, in my community, they congregate around their fragility. They are fragile because of the vagaries of nature. They are fragile because they cannot harvest crops from their fields because of floods, because of lack of rain. So they are hungry. So that hunger brings them together as a community. Low veld is because of floods. They identify with that together as a community. In the Eastern Highlands, it's the flooding. They are used to being in the periphery. They are used to being in the margins of policy making. And that has psychological effects. And those psychological effects are that the communities will see themselves as victims and recipients. So when researchers come, the communities are already psychologically geared to be victims and recipients. So we have to be careful about the questions that we are asking a community that has been conditioned to be fragile and to be recipient. They will tell you about, their victimhood. They will share with you about how they are incessantly hungry and how they cannot harvest anything. Even when NGOs come, communities now know in Zimbabwe that when K International comes, okay, they will bring food. When WFP comes, they will bring cooking oil. So they get a whole grocery list from NGOs. But are we having sustainable solutions for communities? So this is my challenge, that researchers have to be aware of this dynamic and stop reinforcing this and start asking empowering questions. What can you do instead of what do you need? Because when we ask, what do you need? The answer is simple in Zimbabwe. We want food. But when we ask, what do you have? What can you do? You will be amazed at the indigenous knowledge that communities have, the systems that they have used over and over again, passed down for generations. They have been saving their seeds, fields, so that they won't be swept away. You will be amazed. So once we start putting communities at the center of it all, we start moving somewhere. So my argument today as a community person is that when the state is the decision maker and the communities are de facto decision takers, we are not going anywhere. We will go around in circles and we will exacerbate the socio-economic suffering that we should be eliminating. We are increasing human rights abuses, and this is through state, through insufficient restitution, and between communities, as host communities fight with the relocated over scarce resources. Because remember, all the communities, even if there is horizontal inequalities, we have other areas which are richer than others, but the resources are not enough. So when you dump a whole community in a host community and there are scarce resources, what you will have is conflict. And there have been recorded incidences of increased gender-based violence cases, especially against the girl child. I'm going to speak more about the girl child because that's where my passion lies. And I have seen how these relocations affect girl children. You are taking a whole family and a whole community and you are dumping them with no food and at times no land. You don't even give them a kickstart. And what then happens is that the parents of the girl child will marry her off at 9 years old, at 10 years old, so that they can form a kinship with the host couple that they have. So when researchers come and they say, oh, how big is your family? And what do you think you need? They will never tell you that Sostina was married off at 10 years old because we wanted to form a kinship with
David, I'm really sorry to jump in. The video feed is bad and the audio is gone as well, almost.
And I spoke about conflict driving and how the army is used to force people to move. And I have talked about how policies.
Sostina, sorry to interrupt you. The quality of the connection has gone a little bit.
Yes.
And we also have heard your
can you hear me?
Yes. The connection is a little bit we've lost it a little bit, but we've heard your challenge loud and clear, and I hope we can come back to many of the points that you've made in the conversation. I think you've made some very powerful challenges to some of the key concepts that we talk about in these sessions this week around community, what does it mean, and around the state, the role of the state, and you've really demonstrated very clearly and cogently, I think, the ways in which the effects of planned relocation can be so negative when communities have no say in the process. So thanks so much, and we'll return to you in the conversation. Okay. I hope once we've heard from Robin Bronen, who's joining us from Alaska. So we'll have a Robin talk for a few minutes, and then we will have plenty of time for a further exchange between the panelists and our audience. Robin, so Robin also has a unstable but potentially a connection, so she'll keep her camera off to speak and present. So Robin is a human rights attorney and interdisciplinary social scientist. She has a position at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, but is also the director of the Alaska Institute for Justice, which she also co-founded. This institute is focused on climate justice and human rights for Alaskans. And she is working very closely with various stakeholders, starting with First Nations and Alaska Native tribal groups to ensure that their rights are protected. And she's going to speak about experiences of community-led relocation in Alaska. Robin, delighted to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David, for the introduction, and hopefully my voice is coming in clear without my video on. So as David said, I am based in Alaska on the lands of the Dena'ina, the First Nations of these lands, and they have been stewards of these lands for millennia. And I'm really appreciative of all the things that Sostina shared, because in working in Alaska with Alaska Native tribes, I am very mindful of the fact that I am a non-Indigenous white woman working with Alaska Native tribes, and all of my work is to make sure that I do not continue the colonization of these tribes as a researcher or a lawyer. So my challenge to all of you listening is, whatever role you're in, is to really examine your motivation for doing the work and ensuring that community voices, tribal voices are front and center in the way that you are talking about the issue, and also doing whatever research or work that you're doing. I'm also mindful, I listened to Tony Oliver Smith talk, and listened to him talk about how when we're talking about relocation, we often just focus on infrastructure and not on people. And it's because the issues around people are so complex when we're talking about relocation in the face of the climate crisis, which is why for me, and doing the work that I've done now for almost 20 years with Alaska Native tribes, our work has really been to model how relocations can occur and make sure that human rights are embedded in every part of the process. And this is especially important because the World Bank has an involuntary resettlement handbook that Sostina did not mention, but I would assume was part of the awful experience that occurred in Zimbabwe. And it is urgent that we figure out a different model for relocations to occur, because as we all know, greenhouse gas emissions are not reducing, and the fate of possibly hundreds of millions of people who are no longer going to be able to stay on coastlines is at risk. Next slide, please. So I always start by talking about what is happening in the Arctic, because what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. And while these are old slides, they're noteworthy because it's showing that the polar amplification, which really became pronounced in 2018, has continued. So I start with 2018 because it's alarming that in the middle of wintertime, and for those of you not familiar with the Arctic, in our wintertime, the sun does not rise above the horizon. Where I live in Anchorage, it rises barely above the horizon. And if you can see in January and February of 2018, when the sun was not rising above the horizon, there were 62 hours of temperatures being above freezing, which is exacerbating the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. This temperature increase has continued since 2018. And in this past summer, we saw record high temperatures in the northern part of Alaska. So the melting that's occurring has continued to accelerate at great consequence to the Alaska Native tribes that are located along the coast. Next slide, Pete, please. So what's also important to think about in regard to the climate crisis and how the climate crisis is making the places where people live uninhabitable. What is very, very clear in Alaska is that it's the combination of repeated and frequent extreme weather events and slow ongoing environmental change. So on the left of your slide, you will see an image of Arctic sea ice extent, which is decreasing intensively. Arctic sea ice has been the natural barrier that has protected coastal communities for millennia. We don't have seawalls along most of the coast, western coast of Alaska, and Arctic sea ice has been the natural barrier that has protected communities from the extreme weather events that have happened. And last September, so September of 2022, we experienced the X typhoon that was in the northern Pacific, Typhoon Merbok, that devastated 1,300 miles of Alaska's coastline and dozens of Alaska Native communities that have no higher ground to go to. So it's really important to understand the context of this work that we are doing, where there are no roads going to the Alaska Native communities that we work with. And the only way to get to these communities is by small 10-seater planes. So from Anchorage, where I live, I have to take 2 plane flights out to many of the communities that I work with. And it usually costs about $1,000 to get there. So for people who are living in these communities, when these extreme weather events happen, they cannot evacuate and there is no higher ground, which is why we are living in a great humanitarian crisis at this time, because of the combination of the slow ongoing environmental change like Arctic sea ice, the loss of Arctic sea ice extent, and these extreme weather events. Several years ago, working with Alaska Native communities, we identified the term Ushtek. It is a Yupik word meaning catastrophic land collapse. And we worked with natural and physical scientists and indigenous scientists to understand that in Alaska, you cannot silo erosion, flooding, and permafrost thaw and expect to understand the extent of how the lands on which communities are living are becoming uninhabitable. It's important to look at all of the environmental changes that are happening in order to understand why the places where people are living are no longer able to sustain people living in those places. Next slide, please. So the federal and state government have been researching this issue for honestly over 20 years. There have been so many reports talking about the imminent threat to Alaska Native communities. In 2019, there was a statewide threat assessment. That's where the 76 villages imminently threatened comes from. The federal government also has a government accountability office, which has done investigations on what's happening with Alaska Native communities since 2003. They most recently issued a report in 2022, highlighting once again that the federal government in the United States is not providing the resources that are needed for Alaska Native communities to be safe and to implement their planned relocation process. And I'll talk more about this, but it's really important to understand that because of the climate crisis, several Alaska Native communities are being their entire community because they are no longer able to stay where they are. It's important to also know that most of these communities did not choose to be in these places. They were forced to be in these locations by the federal government in the last century because the federal government required Alaska Native parents to send their children to school. The schools were not built, and so the federal government sent barges up the west coast of Alaska, dumped construction material in the places where the barges could land, and that's where the schools were built, and that's where Alaska Native communities were forced to settle permanently. Next slide, please. So when I talk about planned relocation, it's really important for me to define what I'm talking about because there are so many different definitions and also words used. So when I'm talking about planned relocation, I am always talking about it as a voluntary, the right to self-determination being the most important human right to protect. I'm also talking about it as a disaster risk reduction strategy. And what I mean by that is that it is critical that relocations occur before an extreme weather event displaces people, because if a relocation occurs after displacement occurs, it is really, really difficult to protect that right to self-determination and all the other human rights, because people will be in a crisis and will be needing food and shelter and possibly healthcare, and that will be their primary focus, not trying to figure out how they are going to be safe in the long term. It's also very natural. Research has shown that when people are displaced after an extreme weather event, they want to go home. And so it is not the appropriate time to implement a planned relocation process. It's also really important to understand that planned means long-term. Tony Oliver Smith has talked about this a lot. In Alaska, so there are 3 tribes in Alaska that made the decision to relocate. Their tribal governments made that decision over 20 years ago. None of them have fully relocated. 2 of them are kind of in a relocate. Well, one of them is kind of in a relocation, is in a relocation process. The other is kind of in a relocation process. And the third hasn't even started relocation. For the one Utah, which is in a relocation process, only 1/3 to 1/2 of the community has been relocated. And they started their relocation process in 1994. That was the first time the tribal government voted to relocate their community. It took 8 years to do a land exchange for their chosen relocation site, and that happened in 2003. As I mentioned, protecting human rights is critical. And as I've also mentioned, this is not just about infrastructure, it's about community and maintaining social and kinship connections. Next slide, please. So, all of the relocation principles that need to be part of a planned relocation process are already included in existing human rights instruments. There are no human rights instruments that actually have the relocation, the human rights principles that need to be embedded in a planned relocation process. People often refer to the guiding principles on internal displacement. And as I've written for more than a decade, those principles are not appropriate to this context for many reasons. And one of the primary is that if you read those principles, it's all about humanitarian agencies making sure that people have food and healthcare and shelter. And it's not about that empowerment process that Sostina was talking about people being able to make this decision for themselves and recreate their lives in another location that's safe and protecting their human rights. And as I've already mentioned, the right to self-determination is the fundamental human right that we need to be paying attention to in this context. Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, I've been doing this work for 17 years. And when I started doing this work and decided to go back to graduate school to get my PhD, it became very clear that we needed a new model. And so for the last at least 10 years, we've been working with Alaska Native tribes to create that model of human rights being embedded in a relocation process. And we were really fortunate to get a substantial amount of funding last year through the Permafrost Pathways Project, where we are now have the funding to really, and the partnerships to make it possible to model this framework to other parts of the world. Our lead partner agencies are the Woodwell Climate Research Center. They have been doing climate research for decades, and Harvard University's Arctic Initiative. The funding that we've received is to go to Alaska Native tribes, so that the primary funding that we've received goes to Alaska Native tribes. And when I talk about community tribal voices being front and center, and me making sure that I am not replicating a colonial process in doing this work, the steps that we take is, first, we always get tribal government resolutions. For any work that we do, we will not work with a community unless we get a resolution from that tribal government affirming that they want to work with us. We then are now able to provide funding to 10 tribal governments in Alaska so that they can hire staff within their tribal governments to do the work related to the climate crisis. Because one of the things that's not talked about is the exponential and complex part of the work that has to be done when you're relocating an entire community. That is not the part of the job responsibility of any person within a tribal or city government. So the funding that we have is to try to build the capacity of tribal governments so that they are able to do the work needed to relocate their community. Fundamental to that right to self-determination, and to go to what Alex talked about, is the community-based Indigenous-led environmental monitoring. So when we started this work over a decade ago, we went to the 31, at that time it was 31 imminently threatened communities, and asked them what were the environmental changes that were most concerning to them. And they focused on erosion, flooding, and permafrost thaw. So we worked with natural and physical scientists and Indigenous knowledge holders to create a process where they are leading the environmental research that is now happening in their community. And with Woodwell Climate Research Center now being our partner, we are able to do some serious permafrost thaw monitoring with Indigenous knowledge holders. And we were just in several communities this summer doing that work. And we've developed an app also for that documentation of environmental change that is data protected and just for the tribal governments. We also do the policy work. So I work as a lawyer, there are other lawyers in my office, and it's critical that we're decolonizing the governance systems that Sostina talked about that has made it really, really difficult for the tribes to get access to the resources they need. And then finally, we have an annual adaptation workshop with the tribes and federal and state government agencies. Our annual adaptation workshop is actually happening next week. It is we traditionally have had about 40 to 50 people attend. We are having over 150 people come to our workshop next week. If you don't know, the Biden administration has taken on this issue, and they actually published a guideline in March on community-driven relocation, and they've been leading listening sessions in the United States to understand. I was part of those listening sessions, which was focused on practitioners and academics. The people leading that conversation are coming to Alaska next week to meet with tribal governments in Alaska to inform our national policy of how the US federal government needs to go forward and make sure that that right to self-determination, the community-driven, is at the core of any relocation that occurs, because we all know the horrific consequences if that doesn't occur. Last slide, please. So I end with, when I started this work, I used to be an immigration attorney and was determined that we not use the term climate refugee in this context because it is really inappropriate, and created the term climate migration to talk about community-led relocation caused by the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. Wonderful first to see that there is finally a little bit of movement and some money to make things progress after what sounds like a really long and grueling process. And I think your presentation has highlighted many issues, from the importance of taking into account the past histories of displacement, which is something that came up in some of our other sessions, the impact of both the state's past presence and its current absence, also the importance of formal recognition is something that's come out of that I'm thinking about coming out of this, how you get resolutions from communities throughout Alaska. We had a conversation earlier about the recognition of indigeneity in Indonesia, for example, and this is not always a given that it's possible to get even such resolutions or agreements. So there are many issues that we've touched on in these three presentations, and we have a half hour to go deeper into the aspects that we collectively feel are the most interesting and important. The Q&A function is open to our audience if you wish to put in some questions. I do not see any in there currently, but I have many, and I will be very happy to lead us into a conversation, and we'll keep an eye on the Q&A. There are many potential entry points, but I'm going to pick up on the one that Robin left us with, which is the one of language and the one of narrative, the terms we use, the ways in which we represent the realities of communities on the ground from the outside. And I'm going to turn to Alex to start us off with that. There's one word I heard in your presentation that struck me as potentially quite problematic and quite interesting, which was decommissioning. And you said that the government has decided, in essence, to decommission a community, which is a very infrastructural language, very sort of focused on buildings and so on, but seems to ignore the reality of life in Fairborn in this case. So I'm wondering if that sparks any further reflections on the ways in which we talk about and see the realities of communities, and how we can do better in terms of talking about that.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, David. Yes, I completely agree that the language is really crucial. And again, coming at this from a kind of UK perspective, I can say that. Yeah, so decommissioning is I expect that, when I say government, by the way, I don't mean central government, I mean the sort of local council government. Yes, I expect they deeply regret that language now, because that use of that word has definitely inflamed the situation. So I doubt we're going to see the use of the word decommission much in the future. But you're right, it does imply a kind of a technical process. And of course, the questions that people have is not so much on the technical, but it's actually on the social. So, you know, what about all about social networks? Where would we go? When would we have to move? So yeah, it is. I would agree. It's a really sort of problematic term. I mean, more generally, and again, this is coming from a context where there is some there's a kind of some skepticism around the need to relocate from coastlines because of people's attachments to place. The language of managed retreat as well, more broadly, it's kind of unfortunate choice of words in a way, because the retreat element suggests sort of giving up or giving in, if you like. So there's a kind of military sort of metaphor there. And I mean, I guess the language of coastal protection, defense, retreat, it's all linked to, you know, sort of military terms in a way, like a battling the sea and things. So yeah, I would say that there does need to be a wholesale change, I think, or rethink of the vocabulary of relocation, decommissioning, managed retreat, and the words we use are really important.
Thank you, Alex. I'm sorry to say we seem to have lost Sostina. Hopefully she'll be able to rejoin us for this part of the conversation. But I'm going to stay on also maybe this theme of sorry, I'm going to talk, I think, a little bit about the role of science again, and here I'm going to ask Robin also to jump in. One of the things that came out of your presentation, Alex, is that the local community of Fairborn commissioned their own study, and they made science work for them, I suppose, in a sense. And this is a theme that has come through all three of your contributions, which is that sort of careless top-down research can cause lots of problems. But I'm curious to hear about the ways you see in which research can be a useful support mechanism, or at least provide a space where communities can explore the challenges they face and identify solutions that work for them. Maybe let's start on that with Robin. Would you have any comments on this theme?
Yes, so thank you so much for that question, because university-trained scientists have a critical role in working with communities. And I would say it's most intensively in understanding predicted rates of slow ongoing environmental processes, because it's critical to have that indigenous local knowledge to understand the historical and present context of what's happening, and then to marry that with university-trained scientists who can then take that information with permission to create understanding of what will happen with future environmental change. And that's important for two reasons. One, I think the obvious is you need to understand predicted rates of change to make sure that you are protecting people in advance of the environmental changes that are happening. And two, the indigenous knowledge, local community knowledge is critical because people need to believe the information that is being generated and shared with them about what the future conditions are going to be in regard to the environmental changes that are happening in their community. And so it's both of those things. One without the other wouldn't give a complete picture of the environmental change that is being caused by the climate crisis.
Alex, do you have anything to add to what Robin has said?
Yeah, just to add, I mean, that was a really interesting example that you gave, Robin, in relation to community-led environmental monitoring processes. I think it's interesting because often in these cases, again, in the UK, but many other places, there's often there's a kind of hierarchy of knowledge that's going on. So what tends to be valued in these cases is the external scientific expertise, and what tends to be less valued is local sort of contextual knowledge. And often there's a dichotomy that's created between those two. But of course, I mean, local communities have knowledge, but also local communities can be experts and they can be scientific as well, as we saw in that case of the report that was commissioned, that the community commissioned in relation to sea defences. So communities can themselves, under their own efforts, become, you know, quite very informed and quite skillful scientists, and that's been kind of, their action is being forced by the sort of situations that they find themselves in. At the same time, scientists with sort of external expertise want to understand how their science applies to particular places, and they try to adapt their science for particular places. So that kind of dichotomy between the external and the internal, expert and local, is a kind of false dichotomy, really, I think, very often. So we need to sort of recognize that and yeah, find ways to further break that down, I think.
Yeah, I think that's an important takeaway point, that you cannot, should not reduce resistance or reluctance in the face of relocation planning to a sort of scientific illiteracy or lack of knowledge. And precisely as you explained, there is expertise, there is understanding, and a lot of the reasons might be better identified in the politics and in the ways in which decisions and science is used. I see a couple of questions coming in. I'm going to look at those. I'm going to pick up on the point about hierarchy and hierarchy of knowledge, and also on one thing that Sostina mentioned at the beginning of her intervention, which is inequalities and conflicts and hierarchy within communities. And I'm curious to hear, maybe starting with Robin, if this is an issue that you've encountered in the context in which you work, how do communities experience and resolve conflict as it arises in the discussions around relocation?
Yeah, thank you, David. So we do not dive into tribal government decisions. What we do know is, based on the work we've done, is tribal governments create resolutions related to relocation, and either it's an actual vote of community residents or just a process without voting where tribal governments come to the consensus that relocation must occur. And so we rely on those resolutions or votes to then move forward with that community to provide them with the technical assistance and support to help facilitate the connection with federal government agencies to get that funding for relocation.
Great. I think that's a strong answer, and I think it's I suppose a good thing in this context that it's very possible to also step back and leave decision making and not try to be involved. That's clearly also a lesson. I see Sostina is trying to connect back and forth again. I was hoping to pass the question on to her, but we have her contact details, and I know many of you appreciated her talk, so I'm sure she'll be very happy to hear from you through other channels. I'm going to have a quick look at my notes to see what to focus on next, and also the Q&A. So, Robin, there's a question for you, again, about the legislative underpinnings of these negotiations. So tribal governments are making their own decisions, but they're also clearly to affect their decisions, they require external support. Can you say a little bit more about what currently is in place in Alaska, particularly on the legislative side, because I know that Caroline, who's asking the question, is thinking about precisely what the law can do in her context of Kenya.
Yes, thanks for that question. So as I mentioned, the Biden administration has really stepped up. And honestly, it's because of all the advocacy, not exclusively of what the Alaska Native tribes have been asking for a long time. So I believe it was in 2021, 22, the Congress enacted the infrastructure legislation. I don't recall the full name of it. And within that legislation, they created a relocation assistance program that was housed within our federal government Department of the Interior, where all issues related to Indigenous tribes are located within the federal government. As part of creating that legislation, they allocated, I believe it was $100 million to tribal communities around the United States to implement their relocation process. So in Alaska, I believe there were 4 communities that received some of that funding. One of them was Newtok. As I mentioned, they received $25 million to implement their relocation process. And it's really they're piloting this. I think the 3 of us have talked about the complexities, and also the day before, the complexities and legacies of relocations that have really harmed people and great reluctance to step into this space. So this is a pilot of the federal government to try to begin this process, knowing that the climate crisis is going to permanently submerge land where Alaska Native communities are located, and why we're really hopeful for our workshop next week, where we have high-level Biden people coming to listen to tribal governments to not only further enhance what legislation currently exists, but to propose policy changes that need to happen at the national level. And I'm actually quite hopeful, given who's coming to our workshop, that will happen.
Great, thanks, Robin. And we hope with you. And Sostina, are you back with us? I see you've been connecting, but fading in and out. If we have a last chance at exchanging with you, please speak up. I don't think we're so lucky, but I'll take a question that is building on something that Sostina contributed, and it's addressed to Alex. And the question is basically if you can reflect on this concept of decision making and decision taking recipients, and whether or not the Fairborn community has a real chance of countering the decisions of the government.
Yes, thank you. It's a really good question. And it was a good issue that's been raised by Sostina earlier. So it's a small community, but I would say yes, they do have power. On the one hand, it's quite, relatively speaking, it's quite a poor community. So it has working class origins. It's not large sections of the UK for rural coast are quite middle class. But this is a working class place. This is a more controversial point, but some people in Fairborn, because of course Fairborn's located in Wales, but it has an English name, Fairborn. It's not a Welsh name, and some people think that's led to the government of the Welsh government unfairly targeting them. But that's more of a sort of controversial point. But they do have power, and this is where the media plays a really central role. So international, national media attention has, I would say, given the community some power to try to resist the council's plans. So it's all the media attention. It has been a bit double-edged sword. On the one hand, it has raised the profile of the community, so it's enabled them to project their voice nationally and internationally, and to form alliances with other communities facing similar plights. And in fact, one or two people in Fairborn and other similar communities have become almost kind of like celebrities, if you like, through the media, and they quite enjoy that role. On the other hand, other people become very wary of all the attention. They just kind of want the whole thing to go away. So there is this kind of mistrust of the media at the same time. And this is reflected, I think, and this is quite another important point that was raised earlier, around language again. So in the media, the community has been referred to as the UK's first climate change refugees. And there are a lot of people in Fairborn who don't want to be associated with that term because they see it as a kind of having negative, connotations. And there's other people in the community who have adopted the term because they see it as a way of getting attention. And actually, the term climate change refugees has been used by their MP in Parliament as well as a way of trying to bring attention to the community. So it's a very complex situation. But yes, I would say it's a mixture of both. They're both making and taking in a way.
Thank you. I see another question just come in. I think this time for Robin. Have you ever encountered a situation, I think it's returning to this question of not getting involved in community decisions. Have you encountered any situation where you felt like you would have liked to maybe push back against anything that was coming from the community, and perhaps because of suggestion of inequality, and how did you handle that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And the answer is no. I mean, as I mentioned in the very beginning, the heart of what I have tried to do, and I am conscious of this all the time, that I am not Indigenous, and I do not want to be part of the ongoing colonization of the tribes that I work with. So I do not engage in any internal decision-making within those tribal governments, and do everything that I can to uphold tribal sovereignty, because that it's just critically important that tribal sovereignty be upheld. Absolutely.
Thanks for reinforcing that. I think maybe part of this question comes from other contexts where, as Sostina mentioned earlier, there is sometimes a tendency for some community members, and she mentioned the patriarchal structure of the communities in which she works in Zimbabwe as posing this sort of problem. I see Sostina has been here with us for a while, so I wonder if you are able to speak to us and maybe reflect on this question that was just posed to Robin in the context of Zimbabwe. How do external stakeholders, perhaps people such as yourselves in civil society organizations, spiritual leadership positions, perhaps the church, play a role in challenging some of the inequalities that you observe and experience within communities? Are you with us?
Yes, Javed, I'm back, and I'm really sorry. I was gone for a while. I kept trying to come back. Maybe let's try this without the video.
Yes, please. This works great.
It might, yes, thank you. So it's really difficult to navigate when you're working in our traditional communities that are really patriarchal, and you're working with chiefs who are men and they're the custodians of a patriarchal culture. So what we have been doing as X-Alliance is to strengthen church structures, ensuring that we have trainings with faith leaders who are mostly male again. But we have these faith leaders, climate advocacy trainings that we take them through, and also with communities where we bring the traditional leaders, the women, the young people, and the faith leaders together in a conversation, and so that they can try to appreciate the contributions that come from these different sectors. So it's a lot of work, and we are doing it community by community, hoping that this will be replicated in all the other areas that we don't have access to. But it's true that when you face negative patriarchal norms, it really blocks other community voices from coming out. But working with faith structures has been one way where we have been able to infiltrate communities and ensure that we amplify the voices of
It seems we've lost you again, but we got almost all of what you wanted to say, and thank you. I think that really helps answer the question and is an interesting comparison to what Robin was saying. We have 5 minutes left in our discussion. Sorry, Sostina, that you seem to have gone again. I guess just to conclude, I would just love each of you, maybe Alex first, and then Robin, and then Sostina if she's back, to just leave us with some parting remarks. Is there a key takeaway that you would like our audience to leave this session with? Alex, are you there to give us?
I'm here.
Yes.
Well, I mean, the session has just raised so many issues, hasn't it? I think in terms of the theme that's coming through strongly for me again is politics. So the politics of the relations between the communities, the local level, the communities that are directly facing these problems, and then the state, whether that's sort of district level authorities or central authorities. That political relationship is crucial, and then internal politics within communities as well. And in my talk, I didn't have time to get into some of the internal politics in Fairborn and other places that I've looked at, but this is also an important dynamic. And then finally, as I was saying, the politics of knowledge then around the drivers of relocation, resettlement, which is the climate change, but also knowledge around the resettlement program itself. And a colleague of mine was commenting on the fact that, you know, often movement away from coastlines is referred to as managed retreat, but often it's actually unmanaged retreat, or it's poorly managed retreat. So knowledge of resettlement processes as well, I think is, you know, within the community is, and what's fair and who's getting what is I think also really important. So I'll just leave it there. So it's politics for me.
Thank you, Alex. Robin, you have 2 minutes to close us off with a couple of parting words.
Yes, so no, honestly, I'm heartbroken that this is where we're at in our climate crisis, and that we are condemning millions of people to this process that is still unfolding, meaning we do not have a model of how relocations can occur and protect the human rights of people who are going to be forced in this situation. And that really makes my heart break, honestly, watching what's happened in Alaska. So I hope, you know, during the Climate Academy, we get further down the road into providing a model. And we just received funding to take our work internationally and to try to model this in other parts of the world. So to see if what we've created with the tribes in Alaska could work in some other corner of the planet, so that we are protecting the human rights of those who are forced into this awful situation. Thank you. Koyana.
Thank you, Robin. I think that you have touched on our purpose, which is to facilitate this exchange, and the work we're hearing about this week is really demonstrating that there's a long way to go, as you say, but there are also many people thinking very hard about what we can do to make sure that these processes, although they will come, as we've heard, inevitably with many losses, can also happen in the best possible conditions. And that's going to take a lot of work, and we're glad to see so much interest and people joining us to think about these issues and the work we can do together collectively and with care. I think that's also something that's emerged from this conversation, that I hold on to, the importance of being very careful as researchers, as external stakeholders, in the way in which we approach communities, in the way in which we talk about the realities that they are facing, and the care not to erase their perspectives, their voices, and to amplify them instead. So with that, I would really like to thank Alex, Robin, and Sostina for their really excellent, powerful contributions to our conversation. If you'd like to reach out to any of them, I'm sure they'll be happy to talk to you, especially Sostina. I'm sure we can facilitate answering questions that you did not have a chance to ask. With that, we are closing our day of activities here in Bonn, but we will be back tomorrow with 3 sessions for any of you who speak French. We will be opening with a Francophone panel talking about relocations. We'll have perspectives from France and from Senegal. And then we will be back for 1 session on this theme of support and risk perception, and also resistance to relocation, but also places where people are actually arguing and calling for relocation. So different case studies tomorrow morning, followed by more case studies, this time focused on the long-term impacts and what happens after people have moved, in terms of community well-being, in terms of livelihoods, and so on. So thank you very much. Delighted to have had you all here, and looking forward to further conversations this week and beyond.
Thanks, David. Bye-bye.
Bye, Alex. Thank you. Bye, Robin.
Thank you very, very much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.